Good evening, everybody. I just wanted to jump on here real quick this evening and just kind of set the record straight. Like, I don't hate IULs. I just hate the way that they're marketed and the way that people are being lured into the industry that don't really know anything about finances from literally anywhere that has a pulse with the promise of a six-figure income because they have these great IUL leads for truckers or these great IUL leads for insert whatever here for retirement planning, and that's not essentially the best use of the vehicle itself. So I don't want you to take my word for it. I just went to Perplexity and just typed in one of the questions that you should ask that you don't necessarily know what to ask, and it says, what's the likelihood an IUO will perform as illustrated? The first word is usually. It says usually not very likely. An IUL illustration is an optimistic projection, not a guarantee, and real policy results often differ because crediting rates, caps, participation rates, and insurance costs can change over time. Now, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that I guarantee that the cost of insurance will change over time because it's just an annual renewable term. It's a term policy, an annual renewable term, which means that it renews every year. You don't have to requalify. It happens behind the scenes, but that means your cost of insurance goes up every year as you age. So now you're buying it at 46. Next year, it'll renew at the cost of insurance of 47, 48, and so on and so forth. And the other thing that it says here that I'm sure that you never have a conversation about is crediting rates, caps, and participation rates. And I know that those aren't things that are a part of your vocabulary because they're just not common terms that you use in everyday conversation. So if you don't know what those mean, then you're already at a disadvantage and you're being sold something or making an uninformed decision, for lack of a better way to put it, or just making a decision based on the information that they gave you, which oftentimes isn't the entire story. So caps is the maximum amount. And I'll tell you when that comes into play. When they say things like, and I say they because they are a select group of people. There are some people out there that are positioning responsibly. So kudos to them. Hat goes off to them. The utmost respect for them. But there are a bunch of people in the industry that are out there just collecting checks, knowing that you're none the wiser. And by the time you figure it out, it's too late. So a cap is just that. It's the maximum amount that you can be credited. And that's the way that the insurance company ensures their profitability. So they'll say things like, I illustrated this at 6.75%. And if you pull up the S&P 500, and we'll talk about that too, because that's grossly misleading as well. But if you pull up the S&P 500 over the last 20 years and look at this, it's actually done 18 to 20%. So this is a very modest representation. No, the cap is somewhere between 8 and 12%. So regardless of what the S&P does, that is the maximum amount that you're going to get. And then participation rates is just that. It's the rate at which you participate in the growth of that respective index. So if the par rate is, we'll say 70%, and the S&P, because that's what they always lean on, the S&P goes up 20%, then that means that your crediting is going to be 70% of that 20 or 14%, which is great. But if the cap is at 8%, then you only get 8% and the rest of it goes to the insurance company. So a very loaded conversation that I promise you they're not having with you. The other thing is what that means after the first paragraph, the insurance cost can change over time. What that means is an illustration is typically built on current assumptions that can be revised by the carrier, so the policy may perform better in some periods and worse in others rather than tracking the illustrated path closely. One source describes the illustration as a best case scenario rather than something most policies actually hit. So current assumptions means according to the current market today, and the carrier can revise them as they see fit. That within itself should cause you to pause. And then it goes on to say the policy may perform better in some periods, which we just kind of talked about, and worse in others. Often you have a 2% floor or a 0% floor. And if it performs worse, then that illustration goes completely out the window. So the second it doesn't return that 6.75 or whatever it's illustrated at, it completely goes out the window. You should only be considering this vehicle based on the guarantee, the guarantee, that first column that they don't talk about. They say that this is if we go into the next Great Depression or the financial industry falls apart and we have bigger, all the things that they say to just gloss over that. But that's really the illustration that you should be paying attention to, because if that happened, would you still be considering this vehicle? Because the illustration themselves in Perplexity says that the likelihood of it performing the way that it's illustrated, according to current assumptions, that third column is not very likely. I think the illustrations themselves from certain carriers even put it in darker terms, in less favorable terms. So, and then you have to factor in something called the sequence of returns, because we talked about the cost of insurance going up every year. So that's continuing to rise. So if the cost of insurance is continuing to go up and your premium doesn't change, because if it's built properly, it should be maxed out anyway. So that's the ceiling, the maximum amount that you can contribute. So your premium doesn't change, but if you don't get that crediting, the cost of insurance is going up, that premium doesn't change, that shrinks your profitability because your cost of insurance is creeping up. So less money is going toward that cash value. And if it's not crediting at the rate that is illustrated or better, then that illustration again goes out the window, and you gotta just rethink that strategy. And there's a surrender period pretty early on where look at your cash value versus your surrender value and have them explain to you why there's such a significant difference. If it was truly infinite banking, those numbers wouldn't be different at all. Your cash value will be the same as there's no surrender value if it's structured properly, because your cash value is your cash value and you have access to all of it and can access it within 30 days, not 7 to 10 years, because that's when the surrender charges fall off and you can actually access the funds that you set aside, which is another issue in itself, because a lot of times you're trying to put yourself in a better situation. And this is money that you should be using or could be using to enhance your current lifestyle, which you can do if it's truly infinite banking and properly structured policy, but you can't do with the IUL. The next paragraph goes into how to think about it. A good rule of thumb is to treat the illustration as a planning document, not a promise, because it's not. However, if it's an infinite banking policy, one of my favorite carriers to go with, they haven't missed a dividend payment in 120 years. So they pay dividends. The other one pays interest. So we haven't missed a dividend payment in 120 years. And this one is tied to market performance. And we all know what the market does. It was built on risk reward. And prior to its inception, everyone was saving for retirement with insurance. But they needed to stand the banking system back up on the heels of the Great Depression. So the whole risk reward mantra came up. And then fast forward to 97, somebody introduced IULs, and the rest is history. But look at the history. The IUL is just the latest iteration. There were ULs, then there were VULs, variable universal life, where it's actually invested into the market, and then index universal life. So this is really the third time, right? It's definitely the best case scenario, but it's an iteration of something that failed twice before, because it truly should be managed, and the person that's selling it to you doesn't have the capacity to manage it in most cases. But in any case, it says a good rule of thumb is to treat the illustration as a planning document, not a promise. The further the policy depends on high assumed returns, those current assumptions, the more likely the actual outcome will fall short if the index environment policy charges or credits are less favorable than expected. So it's basically saying the more it depends on the returns, the more likely it is to fall short of what it was illustrated as, which is really my issue, because they're selling it and saying things like, if you put X amount of dollars into this vehicle, by the time you're this age, you'll have X amount of dollars to retire on tax free. And that may be true, but as you saw from Perplexity, and whatever conversations or questions you have, definitely go there and ask the questions there, take them back to the agent, come to somebody that truly does infinite banking with a properly structured whole life policy, and then do the assessment from there and figure out which product or which vehicle, because I hate that they're products and I hate that they call them deals when they close them. But figure out what makes the most sense and then make your decision from there. And then it closes out by saying, if you're evaluating an IUL, focus less on whether it can be illustrated and more on the guaranteed values, which I said versus non-guaranteed assumptions, the cap participation rate and the floor, which we talked about, how the policy looks under low crediting scenarios, which is another way of saying guarantee values, the worst case scenario. And most of the IUL illustrations, in their defense, it does have guaranteed, middle of the road, and then current assumptions. But I would only consider the guaranteed worst case scenario because you're planning for your future. And if you're planning for your future, you want something that you can lean on, that you can depend on. And slow and steady wins the race. So one is going to give you these erroneous, elaborate claims, and the other one is going to give you modest growth that has been tried and true for over 100 plus years. And it's what people actually use for infinite banking, like the Rockefellers, McDonald's, the Walt Disney. That's the vehicle that they actually use because the IUL didn't even exist. And the last thing is whether it still works if the costs rise. You have that rising cost of insurance because it's an annual renewable term, or crediting stays modest for years, which is when the sequence of returns comes into play. And if they can't explain to you the sequence of returns, like an average of 18%, there's a number of ways to land at 18%. You can go backwards 20% and then go forwards and land at 18, or you can go forward 4 times and land at 18. That sequence of returns and in the order in which those things happen matters to your retirement. So it's really it's definitely safer than putting money directly into the market. And the living benefits are a great benefit, but that comes with infinite banking as well. And the insurance component is invaluable because while you're planning and building towards retirement or building towards accumulating assets for your family, then if you fall short or something happens and you don't get there, then the life insurance is there to take care of your family because you didn't realize those goals, which is a whole nother conversation because you can get access to about 80 of your cash value in the first 30 days in an infinite banking policy. In an IUL, probably 50% best. So if we're taking the money and putting it into the market or acquiring other assets that generate revenue or using it to buy down debt, infinite banking and a whole life policy gives you much more of an upside to execute those strategies than an IUL does. An IUL is a great secondary product, but if it's your primary means of alternative retirement planning or getting out of debt or mortgage protection, then I would highly recommend you do properly structured infinite banking policy first. And if anything, borrow from your infinite banking policy to fund the IUL. And those are all things that we can talk in depth about or examine your situation specifically and figure out what makes the most sense. But I'm truly here to educate. I want to help. If there are any questions that you have, just DM me, DM Bank for a quick 9-minute overview of how the infinite banking concept works. You can find me on Instagram, Wayne Runs. I'll send you the video. You can text me or DM me on any of the social media platforms, and we'll get you whatever information you need to make an informed decision. And if you've bought an IUL and want to review it, I can promise you, unless you bought it 10 years or more ago, then it's it's probably a better situation for you to shift over to a properly structured infinite banking policy and abandon the IUL just because of all the things that can go left. And the fact that you're not setting aside money, you're just parking it there, using it as your banking system, hence the term becoming your own bank, as opposed to parting ways with your money until sometime in the future when you can actually access it. I hope this was beneficial. I hope it helps. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Let me know how I can be of assistance. I'm truly here to serve. Be well.